everyone, to today's North Carolina Botanical Gardens virtual lunchbox talk. I'm Lauren Green, Youth Environmental Education Specialist and Interim Public Program Support. Thank you everyone for joining us today. We have Misty Buchanan today who will be talking about North Carolina's Natural and Working Land Action Plan, what recommends activities that will help increase North Carolina's resilience to natural disasters and offset greenhouse gas emissions. If you live in our area, we hope you'll come by for a visit to our display gardens, which are open to the public Tuesday through Sunday. We would like to thank our Spring 2021 Lunchbox Talk event hosts, Sims Preston and Olympia Stone, for supporting our Spring Lunchbox Talk series at the Dogwood level. Lunchbox Talk event hosts provide funds that support program planning for diverse audiences, including captioning talks that are recorded and made available to the public. David Michaud is my partner in moderation today and will be assisting with Q&A throughout the talk. Misty Buchanan is the director of North Carolina's Natural Heritage Program, which provides scientific data to support conservation of North Carolina's natural areas. Misty works with a team of biologists who survey the state in search of rare species and high-quality natural areas that are important for our state's biodiversity. Before becoming NHP Program Director in 2013, Misty served as the lead botanist and inventory manager. Prior to joining the Natural History Program, Misty worked as ecologist at the North Carolina Botanical Garden and previously with a private consulting firm. Misty is a North Carolina native and holds a MS degree in botany from NC State University and a BA from Smith College. Thank you for joining us, Misty. If you'll please share your screen, Misty, when you are ready.
All right, well, thank you to the Botanical Garden for inviting me to talk with you today about North Carolina's Natural and Working Lands Action Plan. As Lauren mentioned, I'm the director of North Carolina's Natural Heritage Program, and our mission is to inventory North Carolina's biodiversity and to use the information to help establish a network of nature preserves that will help protect our natural heritage for future generations. But I'm going to talk with you today about a broader state government initiative that I've been working on for the past 3 years. When I was first asked to work with the Natural and Working Land Stakeholder Group, my first response was, I don't know anything about climate change. What does this have to do with the Natural Heritage Program? What can I do about this issue? It's too big, it's too complicated. And so I really had to challenge myself to learn more about this topic. Now it's almost 3 years later, and I love working with natural and working lands because I've realized that we offer solutions to many of the climate-related challenges we face here in North Carolina. We found that nature has an amazing ability to heal itself. And when we're working in this field of climate change, it can be so easy to become overwhelmed with the magnitude of the problems and just really lose hope. But by looking at how our natural and working lands can help us accomplish and deal with some of these challenges, we really can get a better sense of how everyone can work together to combat climate change. So the Natural and Working Lands Plan has things that individuals can do. It has recommendations for small businesses, for state government, for nonprofit organizations. And we also have some small recommendations that are going to be fairly easy for people to work on. We've got medium-term recommendations. Then we have some big ideas that are going to take many people working together over many years to really see the changes that we need to see. So the Natural and Working Lands Plan I'm going to talk about was released in June of 2020, but we really see this as a starting point for our work together with the stakeholder group and with all of the people who are interested in working on this issue. We've created a framework to work together and for us to organize our thoughts about how we can accomplish some of these big picture goals. And so we're really reaching out to people who are working in this field to help us accomplish some of these recommendations. So I am going to begin my presentation with another poll, and the topic of this poll is executive orders. I'd like to know what you all know about executive orders related to climate change. So please, if you just take a minute to answer these questions. Have you read or are you familiar with executive orders related to climate change? And check all that apply. And the options would be Governor Cooper's commitment to address climate change, which came out in 2018, President Biden's tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad, which was signed in January of 2021. Maybe you know of other states' executive orders. And if you know of none, that is wonderful, because I'm here to tell you all about the work that North Carolina is doing. Okay, so it looks like we've got about 90% participation in our poll so far. About almost 40% of people have heard of Governor Cooper's executive order. We've got about 53% who are not familiar with any executive orders related to climate change, and 37% are familiar with President Biden's executive order. All right, so I'm going to share with you a little bit about how these orders relate to the work that I am doing with the Natural and Working Lands Group. So the first one I'll talk about is Governor Cooper's Executive Order 80, which was signed in October of 2018. And it really directed North Carolina's cabinet agencies to work together to address some very specific challenges that our state is facing related to climate change. I've shown a few on this slide. I'm just going to talk about a few. There's several more provisions in the executive order. One of them is to reduce North Carolina's greenhouse gas emissions to 40% below the 2005 greenhouse gas emissions level. So that's our benchmark that we're aiming for by 2025. It also directed North Carolina's Department of Environmental Quality to create a clean energy plan, which they have done. And it directed the Department of Transportation to create a zero emissions vehicle plan, which they have also done. And it directed all of the cabinet agencies to work together to create a climate risk assessment of how climate changes are going to affect state government, how they are affecting state government, and the communities that we serve and the missions that we serve, and then make recommendations for how we can address those issues. And that really created the framework for the Natural and Working Lands Group to come together to participate in this process. A more recent executive order came from President Biden in January of 2021, and the title of this is Tackling the Climate Crisis at Home and Abroad. And this executive order is far more sweeping in scope. It has quite a few more provisions, but it does have some similar things that we also saw in Governor Cooper's executive order. One of the things is tackling emissions, and this goal is to reduce the United States greenhouse gas emissions to zero emissions, net emissions, by 2050. It also directed the federal government to create a clean electricity plan and to create a vehicle procurement strategy that includes zero emissions vehicles, fairly similar to what we're trying to achieve here in North Carolina. And then I also recognize the importance of natural and working lands in mitigating greenhouse gas emissions. And so I'm just going to read this section to you. It's a little bit wordy, but it really speaks directly to the topic that I'm going to talk about today. So the language here says, America's farmers, ranchers, and forest landowners have an important role to play in combating the climate crisis and reducing greenhouse gas emissions by sequestering carbon in soils, grasses, trees, and other vegetation, and sourcing sustainable bioproducts and fuels. Coastal communities have an essential role to play in mitigating climate change and strengthening resilience by protecting and restoring coastal ecosystems such as wetlands, seagrasses, coral and oyster reefs, and mangrove and kelp forest, to protect the vulnerable coastlines, sequester carbon, and support biodiversity and fisheries. So there's a lot in here. It really speaks to the heart of the Natural and Working Lands Plan I'm going to talk about today. Another one of the provisions of this document includes a goal to conserve 30% of U.S. land and water by the year 2030. And that is a pretty ambitious goal. In the Natural Heritage Program, we maintain data on the protected lands in North Carolina. And so when we saw this goal, we were asked by several people. Many different people started calling us and saying, where are we in relation to that goal? What percentage of North Carolina is currently protected? And by our analysis, currently about 12% of our state lands are considered protected to the level that would meet the criteria for President Biden's order. So we have quite a ways to go in North Carolina by 2030 for sure. We also did get the question about Wake County specifically. Where's Wake County? What percentage of land in Wake County has protected? And that is almost 12% as well. So very consistent with the statewide measure. So we will talk a little bit more. Now, I know that I have some very scientific-minded people in our audience today. So this slide is for you, and then I will try to not be quite such a bureaucrat for the rest of my presentation. But for people who want to learn a little bit more about all of these plans that our state government has produced related to climate change, you can visit the website. If you just Google North Carolina Climate Risk Assessment and Resilience Plan, you will find a set of reports that were released together in 2020. And so our plan is part of that report. If you want to just learn a little bit more, you can go to the summary and key findings section, and this provides a good overview of our plan. You could go to the main report, and the main report is where each of the cabinet agencies identified the changes that are happening in the sectors that we're working with and how we can address those changes. And so I worked specifically on the section related to ecosystems in North Carolina, and I worked with some wonderful people from the Division of Marine Fisheries and the Division of Coastal Management and the Natural Heritage Program to identify which sectors of our ecosystems are most at risk related to climate changes and what we can do to help make those sectors more resilient. Other agencies wrote about transportation, health and human services, land quality and water quality. So it's a really comprehensive assessment of where we are related to climate change and where we want to be. And then there are a set of appendices with even more information. The first appendix is our climate science report. And the climate science report is really the official reference for state government about the changes that we are seeing in climate, what we have seen recently and what we expect to see within the next 50 to 100 years. And so this is a really good document that really addresses quantitatively changes in temperature, both daytime temperature and nighttime temperature, changes in precipitation, sea level rise. So it's a really great review of the current climate science for North Carolina. And then the second appendix is what I'm going to talk about today is the Natural and Working Lands Plan. And this is where we have the 25 recommendations for how our conservation lands and our forests and farms can help store more carbon and reduce greenhouse gas emissions for our state. And then the final two appendices are proceedings from workshops that were held around the state to gather information and input and concerns from people all around the state, so that this really wasn't created in isolation, but we're really hearing from people about what their concerns are and trying to address those in the document as well. So one of the first things we did as we started working on the Natural and Working Lands Plan was to look at where we stand in relation to greenhouse gas emissions in North Carolina. So the DEQ, Department of Environmental Quality, led the greenhouse gas emissions inventory, and Paul Hemmer, an air quality engineer from DEQ, used the EPA tool that was created for states to assess their greenhouse gas emissions. And the most recent year that we have the emissions inventory is from 2017, and that's what this slide is showing. But here you can see the main sectors where the emissions are coming from in North Carolina. So, and I hope that you can see the top right-hand corner of your screen here, but if you can't, I'll just read it to you. The total gross greenhouse gas emissions for that year, 2017, was 148 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents. And so that carbon dioxide equivalence takes into account methane, carbon dioxide, and other greenhouse gases that are contributing to global warming. And so what we saw for this particular year was electricity was 52 million metric tons, residential and commercial industrial combustion was 20.9, transportation was another leading source of emissions, that was 48 million metric tons. And then there were also emissions from agriculture, waste management, industrial, and natural gas and oil systems. And so these are all the main sources of greenhouse gas emissions for our state. Then when we look at land use and forestry, we're seeing emissions in the negative axis. And what that means is the land use and forestry sectors are actually pulling greenhouse gases out of our atmosphere and sequestering carbon dioxide. And our mission for the Natural and Working Lands Group is to hold on to this sector and to help offset emissions even more in the future. So currently, land use and forestry offset about 25% of our emissions in North Carolina. So other parts of our state government are trying to reduce emissions. What we want to do is increase carbon sequestration in our natural and working lands. And I should note this 25% offsetting number for North Carolina is far above the national average. On average, other states, land use and forestry sectors sequester about 11% of emissions from other states. So we're very far above the national average. And that reflects the high percentage of land that we currently have in forest and natural lands. So this brings us to our second poll. This is a question about working lands in North Carolina. I'd like to know how much you all know about working lands. What are working lands? And if you have an answer, please put it in your chat. And I'd like to ask David if you could read some of those definitions as they come in of what are working lands.
Absolutely. Not seeing any yet, but as soon as they come in. One participant suggests land used for commercial purposes.
Well, the reason why I wanted to bring this up is because it kind of is a jargony term that we use in state government, but I want to make sure that we're all on the same page as far as what working lands represent in North Carolina.
A few more people typing in answers. Agricultural lands, forests, game management areas, any land that provides a service, including ecosystem services, nurseries, places where a combination of natural and human systems generate economic benefit, lands in active use for commercial and related purposes, agriculture, forests, etc.
Great. Well, these are really good definitions, and I'm not going to try to improve upon them because you all have definitely captured what I'm trying to convey here much better than I could as far as what are working lands. I do think of them as lands that are producing a commodity. It might be for agriculture, for forestry, even oyster farms, for example, could be considered working lands. According to Audubon, roughly 1 billion acres in the United States are currently in agriculture, and that's about half of the land in the lower 48 states. So our working lands do provide a huge opportunity for helping us to sequester and store carbon in the plant material and in the soils. Okay, in North Carolina, this pie chart shows how land is broken down as far as land use in North Carolina. And what you can see is about 42% of our lands are currently forested. About 20% of our lands are in agriculture, 15% in wetland, 11% of our lands are developed, and 8% are in open water, and that's largely from our sounds, our estuaries, and our rivers and lakes. So the forestry sector and the wetland and agriculture sector are places where we really want to put a lot of effort to help increase carbon storage in these areas. They present a large amount of opportunity areas for us. If we specifically look at forests in North Carolina, about 85% of our forests are in private ownership and 15% are in public ownership. And this tells me two things about how we need to approach this work. The first is government cannot do this alone. We need to work hand in hand with the private landowners to identify ways that are going to be beneficial for everyone for managing and restoring land to help sequester and store more carbon. The 15% of land that is in public ownership are places where we can provide leadership about land management and restoration to help private landowners understand what the possibilities are. We can also do research to understand the economic feasibility and the benefits related to different management practices. So there's a lot of area here where government and private landowners can work together. Also, another area where there is a huge amount of opportunity for North Carolina would be the riparian areas. We have 38,000 miles of rivers in North Carolina, 12,000 miles of estuarine coastline around our sounds, and 322 miles of ocean coastline. And all of these miles are areas where we can manage the land in a way that increases our resiliency to flooding and natural disasters. We can also increase our carbon storage. And so through all this process, we've come to recognize that the natural and working lands are not just beneficial for our environment, but they're also beneficial for our economy. So there's a lot of win-wins here. We have so much opportunity and there's so many benefits all across the board. But looking specifically at the economy, the natural and working lands provide about 20% of our gross state product for our state economy. And so if we look specifically at the agriculture sector, $91.8 billion coming to the state from the agriculture sector each year, $1.1 billion from coastal tourism and recreation, $32.8 billion from forestry, and $188 million from fisheries. So these are all places where we can work together to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and improve our economy and keep North Carolina such a great place for us to live and work. So with all of these benefits recognized, we pulled together a stakeholder group beginning in 2018 to identify what are the most important things that we can work together on to help advance this issue. And this slide here shows some of the participants in our stakeholder group who are with us all throughout the 3-year process and can continue to work together. I'm not going to try to read them all out, but I hope what you can see here is that we have a really good cross-sector of organizations that brought a huge amount of expertise, which we desperately needed as we were starting to get organized around this. So we have people from universities, from state government, from federal government, the Fish and Wildlife Service and the U.S. Forest Service. Also, we had some key nonprofits working with us, the Nature Conservancy, Environmental Defense Fund, the Conservation Fund, Conservation Trust for North Carolina. I said I wasn't going to try to list them all, so I'm not. But just know that this is really a stakeholder-led effort. I'm the current facilitator of this group. Previously, Paula Hemmer was the facilitator, and our role here is just to help people work together, to see what good ideas emerge, and to help those gain momentum. And so it's really been so important for us to get the input from all of the people, the cities and towns, the government units, the nonprofits, the individuals who have worked with us along the way. When we first got together, began just really trying to figure out how we're going to work together, we decided to first agree on a set of principles that would guide us as we go down this path towards reducing our greenhouse gas emissions through improved carbon sequestration. And so we developed this set of guiding principles. First and foremost, we're to get working together to enhance carbon sequestration and mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. But we recognize very quickly there are several benefits that go along with that. We can also identify strategies that will help build resilience in our ecosystems and our communities, that provide public health and ecosystem co-benefits. Also creating economic opportunities for agribusiness, recreation, and tourism. And also want to make sure that implementation is socially equitable across all of the sectors of North Carolina's all of our state and all of our human populations. So with these guiding principles, we broke up into 6 different committees who worked on different land use areas. So we created a forestry committee, floodplains and wetlands, PCOSANs, coastal habitats, agriculture, and urban lands. And so this brings us to our next poll. So our next poll is about land ownership among our viewers today. So do you own land in one or more of these categories? And please check all that apply. And the categories again: forestry, floodplains and wetlands, ecosins, coastal habitats, agriculture, and urban lands. And if you don't own land in any of these sectors, that is okay too. There's still a lot that everyone can do to help influence how these lands are managed in our state. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and end polling here.
And Misty, I'm learning it looks like participants did not have the option to check multiple selections here.
Oh, okay.
So the results may be a little bit inaccurate.
Okay, all right. Are people able to see the results on the screen now?
They are now.
Okay, all right. So what we're seeing here, we have, I guess the largest land ownership category we have is urban lands. Not surprising, given our audience, where people are watching from today. And we also have some representation in forestry, floodplains and wetlands, and coastal habitats. All right, so I am going to go through the recommendations from each of these sectors. And we will begin with actually the transformative recommendations that we thought really actually kind of span all of the sectors and have the most power to help us store and offset our greenhouse gas emissions. So the sort of most transformative recommendation that we identified was protecting and restoring forests and wetlands within flood-prone areas. And as part of our analysis, we had quite a bit of data help from Lydia Olander and Katie Warnell at Duke University at the Nicholas School for Environmental Policy Solutions. They mapped opportunity areas statewide using information on where carbon is currently stored in our state from the Forest Inventory, from the U.S. Forest Service, and from World Resources Institute and American Forests. We also got quite a bit of mapping help from the Nature Conservancy as we were identifying the largest opportunity areas for North Carolina. But one of the things we found, and there's several examples and statistics in our report, but if we want to really focus on where we can get the most impact for our land protection and restoration, we can look at our floodplains and our watersheds. Just as one example, one statistic, about 5% of North Carolina's unprotected forests are in floodplains of watersheds where there are more than 10 point sources of pollution, things such as wastewater treatment plants, hog waste lagoons, any sort of industrial emissions. If we just protected those forests that are in those watersheds where there are more than 10 point sources of pollution, that would be 1 million acres right there of land to be protected. And those are some of the highest priority areas for protecting water quality. And they can also help, provide wildlife habitat as well as storing and sequestering carbon. And if we look specifically at land restoration, if we just looked at all of the undeveloped, non-agricultural land that is not in forest, that could be in forest, if we were to restore those places to forest, that would be an additional 1 million acres of forest that could be restored in North Carolina. If we were to restore that forest, that would increase our greenhouse gas sequestration annually by 10%. So there's a lot of room for growth here in North Carolina in terms of greenhouse gas sequestration. Another transformative recommendation was to facilitate voluntary landowner participation in carbon offset and ecosystem services markets, basically paying people to keep their land in forest. And there are carbon markets already operating around the United States. The carbon marketplace can be compliance-based. So California has a compliance-based carbon market. The Northeastern United States has a compliance-based market. We could create a voluntary carbon market here in North Carolina by reducing some of the barriers for participation. So our recommendation is to create some sort of technical program that would help remove and reduce some of those barriers to participation. It might be nonprofit, might be a government partnership, that would help make it more feasible for landowners to participate in carbon offset markets so that they could get funding to keep their land in forest and to manage it appropriately. So just some examples of the barriers to participation. It's very expensive to develop a carbon market project. There has to be a really detailed carbon inventory. There has to be monitoring and auditing. There has to be a forest management plan. It can cost up to $100,000 to create a project. And so it's really not cost effective for landowners who own less than 2,500 acres. And we just don't have a lot of private landowners in North Carolina who own more than 2,500 acres where it would really be feasible for them to participate in the carbon marketplace. But we could help aggregate landowners so that smaller landowners could work together to participate in carbon markets. We could create an insurance program so that if the forest is damaged by wildfire or hurricanes, the landowners won't have to pay the money back to the carbon marketplace. So there's several examples of things that we could do that would make it easier for landowners to continue to keep their forest in forest and manage it in a way that's going to be beneficial for the climate. The third recommendation is to build a multi-state toolbox for natural and working land solution. When we first started working on this issue in North Carolina government, we didn't have a lot of expertise in government, so we had to look at our partners to guide us and give us advice about where we could get the biggest benefits for our work. But we were very fortunate. We worked with the U.S. Climate Alliance. We worked with the universities and the nonprofits I've already mentioned. And now that we have this framework for working together, we would like to share it and so that we could help our neighbor states and continue to learn from each other moving forward. And then the fourth recommendation is to integrate climate adaptation and resiliency strategies into local government comprehensive plans. In North Carolina, if a local government wants to have zoning rules, they have to have a comprehensive plan. This recommendation came from our urban lands group, and they recommended that if we were to slightly change that law to also require the comprehensive plan to address climate and resilience issues, that would help each local government to really identify what they can do and then start putting some of those practices into place. Next, we're going to look at the forestry sector, and this is our next largest set of recommendations specifically related to forests. But as I said, there's a lot of overlap here for wetlands and coastal habitats as well. So the fifth recommendation we had was to conserve forest lands through easements and acquisitions. And there are a number of agencies that help fund land acquisition that would help protect forest land. Just as an example, in North Carolina, the North Carolina Land and Water Fund is one of the primary sources of state government funding for land conservation and planning and restoration. Last year, the North Carolina Land and Water Fund awarded almost $15 million for land conservation restoration projects. This year, we're in a new grant funding cycle, and we've already received 100 applications, roughly, totaling $76 million. So we haven't got the budget set yet for this funding cycle, but we know there's going to have to be a big increase if we're going to meet the demand. And I will just say as well, the Botanical Garden Foundation does have an application in that pool for expanding the Stillhouse Bottom Nature Preserve, and that effort is being led by Johnny Randall. So another recommendation would be to modernize forest policy and tax incentives. There are a number of ways that we can make it easier for landowners to keep their land in a natural condition or in forested condition. It could be timber stands. So one example would be to expand the present use value tax program that allow smaller landowners and corporations to participate in that tax benefit. And that would help them resist development pressures and keep their land forested. Another recommendation along those lines would be to reinstate the conservation tax credit so that if people donate their land to conservation, they can get a tax credit to help offset their income taxes. And that was a program that was in place until it was repealed a few years ago, but it could be restored. And we did see huge benefits for conservation under the Conservation Tax Credit Program. So another recommendation would be to expand restoration on public lands. And we do have so many state agencies that own public lands and manage public lands. We have our game lands, state parks, state forests, plant conservation preserves, or coastal reserves. There's ample opportunity areas for us to be leaders in land restoration and land management. Along those same lines, we would encourage restoration and reforestation on private lands. And there are a number of existing programs within the North Carolina Forest Service and the NRCS that can help provide technical assistance and funding for land restoration on private lands. And along those same lines, increase technical and financial assistance for forest management. There's the Forest Development Program in the North Carolina Forest Service that could be expanded to provide more opportunities for landowner participation. And then finally, support wood products markets in North Carolina. We already have a very robust forestry industry, which is what does contribute to offsetting so much of our greenhouse gas emissions already. But one thing that we looked at was when timber stands are harvested, if the wood then goes to an industry that will allow it to continue to store the carbon into the future, such as building materials, then that continues to be a carbon sink even after the trees are harvested. So we want to encourage wood products markets that will keep the carbon in those trees even after they're harvested and sold.
Can I interrupt real quick, Misty?
Yes.
We do have a question that's pretty relevant to your last slide there.
Okay.
In terms of carbon sequestration, do rapid growth tree farms trap more carbon, or does preserving old growth forest?
Well, there is quite a bit of debate about that topic. So from what I understand, when forests are young, they sequester more carbon as they're growing. But the carbon that they store accumulates over time, so that big trees actually hold more carbon. And so we did have some very lively discussions within the forest group about what recommendations would really be most appropriate here. And we didn't all agree on all of the recommendations that we came out with, but we really looked for places where we could work together to really achieve the biggest outcomes.
All right, thank you for that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we'll move on to floodplains and wetlands. So we had one main recommendation specifically related to floodplains and wetlands, but we do want to recognize many of the recommendations that appeared within forestry, PCOSNs, coastal lands, and the transformative recommendations also specifically apply to floodplains and wetlands too. But we wanted to recommend that we have a more coordinated floodplain buyout system and have better coordination among restoration programs that will help increase resilience and carbon storage. So in North Carolina, the primary sources of floodplain buyouts are from FEMA and HUD, and they occur after floods damage properties. We would recommend that local governments work to create a buyout plan before disasters hit that would help them have a more coordinated system for buying properties as they become available. Because what happens all too often is we have a checkerboard pattern of floodplain buyouts, which really prevents us from having a more systemic restoration and being able to really restore the floodplains that are purchased through these buyout programs. So there's quite a bit of work already being done within the North Carolina Office of Recovery and Resilience to help jumpstart this recommendation. This brings us to our next poll. And the topic here is PCOSNs. And this picture that you see here is a photo of a PCOSN that was taken by Dale Suter from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service of PCOSN Lakes National Wildlife Refuge. So what is a PCOSN? We'd like for you to answer in the chat box. And once again, I'm hoping you come up with better answers than I have.
All right, we have swamp on a hill. A couple of answers about swamps. It's like a 50-50 split with participants, about half know, half don't know. A natural lake or pond that's not an impoundment. A hole once created by glaciers and now flooded land. Swamp on a hill once again.
All right, great. Well, these are good answers, and we got a lot of answers that I also would have said. The swamp on a hill is one we hear quite often. The definition that I'm working with is that a pocosin is a wetland bog that occurs along the outer coastal plain from Virginia to Florida. And it is an area where there is minimal drainage. And so the wetland soils allow peat to build up over time. And we can get very, very deep peat soils in our pocosins. North Carolina historically had about 75% of the pocosin ecosystem that existed in the Atlantic coastal plain. And these are very important areas because they are places where carbon is stored at a huge rate underground and in the above ground plant material. So we have some recommendations specifically related to pocosins because of their huge importance for North Carolina's carbon storage. And they're also very important natural communities for North Carolina rare species. If y'all heard my wolf presentation a couple of years ago about eastern red wolves, they live in pocosins. We have several recommendations specifically related to pocosins. I'm going to read them all and then talk about them all together. Re-wet hydrologically altered peatlands to prevent soil loss and catastrophic fire. Reforest peatlands with Atlantic white cedar. Enhance soil health and retention on working peatlands through best management practices and drainage management. We do have quite a bit of farming in the area where peatlands have historically occurred. And then implement targeted interventions to prevent peatlands from sea level rise and saltwater intrusion by scenario-based modeling. And these recommendations are already being worked on to a large extent by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Nature Conservancy, North Carolina Coastal Land Trust, and other state land management organizations that are working together to help identify the pocosins that are most in need of restoration and protection. In North Carolina, we have had a large percentage of our pocosins have already been altered. About 70% have been ditched and drained. And about half of those ditched and drained pocosins are actually now on public lands. And that adds up to about 500,000 acres. So we have 500,000 acres on public lands currently where we can work to restore those pocosins so that they will continue to have carbon benefits and also habitat benefits for rare species. And then looking at coastal habitats, our recommendations are to provide incentives for coastal habitat protection through, again, tax breaks and planning, facilitate migration of coastal habitats through protection of migration corridors, and prioritize climate change and sea level rise in coastal habitat restoration planning. So the idea here is that as we're seeing sea levels rise and changes happening along our coastline, let's not write those systems off. Let's plan around them even more so that we can recognize the changes that are going to be coming in the landscape. And we can provide places where the marshes themselves can migrate to so that they will provide homes for the birds and the animals and the plants that require marshes for their survival. And we can do that through planning, through coastal planning, and through looking at historical trends to try to understand what's going to be happening next. And then finally, we're coming to the end. We've got 25 recommendations total, so just a couple more slides. Looking at urban lands. So the urban lands group specifically was recommended protect urban forests through a program of tree management to help foster the retention and management of urban trees. Protect and restore forested lands in water supply watersheds. So you're seeing this theme of protecting again and again and again, protecting and restoring. Also, we can do more in urban lands to improve site preparation and soil amendment during land development. The way that the land is treated during the land clearing phase, when the trees are being cut and the land is being prepared for development, has a huge effect on whether the carbon that is currently on the ground and in the soil will be able to stay there or if it gets released into the atmosphere. So there are a set of recommendations about best practices for land clearing that you can still actually keep some carbon in the soil if you do it thoughtfully. Also, researching the changes that our urban canopy is going to face through climate change and helping plan for more resilient trees and manage those trees in a way that they will be able to withstand the future changes. And then finally, we come to agriculture. So the recommendations related to agriculture are encourage soil conservation practices on croplands and pasture lands. And there are already a number of tools and programs that are helping farmers with this. We could expand and support those programs. Improve manure management on farms. Manure on our animal farms can be a source, it is a source of greenhouse gas emissions for our state. So we recognize that our farms can both help sequester carbon dioxide in some areas, and there are also emissions in other areas. And so there were a set of recommendations specifically related to manure management, including some short-term recommendations and some longer-term research recommendations. And then finally, encourage food system efficiency through reduced food loss and waste, basically recognizing the waste that is created when food does not get eaten, when the food that is grown gets wasted, and trying to identify places all along the production pipeline where we can reduce that waste. So those are the 25 recommendations, and I'm showing you here how you can find the Natural and Working Lands Plan. You can also Google it. It's available online on the Department of Natural and Cultural Resources Natural and Working Lands website. And the website does include the plan that I've just gone over, as well as our data methods, if you want to dig into that, and then a summary of our recommendations. So this brings us to our final poll, and the question for you are, what can you do to help our natural and working lands sequester and store more carbon and offset greenhouse gas emissions? And we would like to ask you to put your answer into the chat.
And while folks are doing that, we did have one question come in that's pretty relevant. How did greenhouse gas emissions change during the pandemic?
That's a really good question. We, in North Carolina, our Paula Hemmer, our air quality engineer who's in charge of our greenhouse gas emissions inventory, is currently working on an updated inventory. But it really takes a lot of time for us to get good numbers. And so we don't have that number officially in state government now. There probably are some pretty good estimates out there from other climate alliance groups, but I don't have a good answer for you.
Understandable. We're starting to see some responses coming in. Planting carefully in the area we farm is one. Continue to purchase forested lands and protecting with conservation easements. Planting native trees and putting in a rain garden to help reduce erosion. Let leaves and grass trimmings return to soil to increase soil organic matter. Plant more trees. Mow my lawn less frequently. I can absolutely get behind that one. Get wood chips from arborists to enrich soil. Donate to land and water management groups. It's always a great suggestion. One participant wrote in that she owns a lot on a TVA lake in Western North Carolina that they're treating as a preserve for native plants. Stop food waste. One person got rid of their lawn entirely. Minimize travel, use less energy.
Great. These are great ideas. So, I mean, for me, it's just really inspiring to know that all of these small things, some small, some are large, that we can do all kind of work together to help make our world a better place, provide more habitat for pollinators, for wildlife, increase water quality, and they also, now we know, help offset our greenhouse gas emissions. So we have time for a few questions if you'll have questions. Also, if you want to reach out directly to me and provide feedback on anything I've shared today, or if you want to work with the Natural and Working Land Stakeholder Group, we still have a number of committees that are working together to help advance these recommendations. We'll be having a large stakeholder group meeting in June, probably virtually. We'll be able to dig into a little bit more of the progress we've made on some of these recommendations at that meeting.
A few of the questions that have come in. I think this one is in regards to carbon sequestration. How does the traditional suburban lawn compare to a native species landscaping?
Right. Well, I can't give you specific numbers, but I would say if you look at the carbon both below ground and above ground, you can kind of get a sense of the difference, because carbon is stored in the plant material. It's in the stems, the leaves. Obviously, woody shrubs and trees contain even more carbon. They're also respiring carbon, so they're pulling carbon out of the atmosphere, putting it into that plant material, and the roots as well. So the roots also are storing carbon. And then as you're able to incorporate down leaves and woody debris into the soil and keep it on the ground, those places are also storing carbon.
Great. This is a numerical question, so you might not have the exact answer, but how many millions of acres need to be protected in order for us to reach 30% protection?
Yes, that is a very good question. So currently we have I think it's about 4 million acres are protected in North Carolina, and that includes state land as well as federal land and private organizations such as the Botanical Garden. So we have 4 million, that's about 12%. So we need to get a lot higher if we want to get to 30%.
Absolutely. Does anyone have an economic incentive to want to keep the Precosins ditched and drained?
Well, there are quite a bit of large farms on our outer coastal plain in areas where the ditching has made it possible to grow crops. And so those are places where we have groups like the Nature Conservancy and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service working with the farmers to identify places where they may be able to control the water in the ditching to still allow there to be some carbon in the soil even while the crops are standing. There are also farm programs that will allow farmers to identify places that may be less productive, and they may take those out of production and restore those Pocosin areas to try to help increase the carbon sequestration and the resilience of those areas.
And this may have been on your list of partner organizations, but is the NCDA involved in this effort?
Absolutely, yes. The Department of Agriculture is a very great supporter for this program. They've worked with us in the forestry group as well as the agriculture group.
Wonderful. And it looks like we just have one last question. How can we get farmers to change their farming practices to a more regenerative agricultural method?
That is a great question. And we believe that it really could be achieved through helping make it economically feasible. I think, in the end, they want the land to be productive and healthy as much as anybody does, but we need to provide programs that will help them make those changes that are necessary.
And one more question did sneak in. Are you doing anything to encourage plant-rich diets, like supporting nut orchards or more diverse vegetable, fruit, and grain farming?
Those were some of the recommendations that were considered by the agriculture group, and they are still great ideas. They didn't make it into our top 25, but they definitely are out there as things that we could do to help increase our resilience and our greenhouse gas sequestration, for sure.
And one last super important question, is there a way that folks can get volunteering with y'all?
Absolutely, yes. Please do contact me after the meeting if you want to participate. we have several areas where we need help. So no matter what your skill level, what your interests are, we can definitely put you to work.
And we'll include an email address for you as well as some additional resources in the follow-up email to all registrants. Within the next few days, we'll send everyone a link to the recording of this presentation in case you missed anything or want to look over anything again.
Great. Well, thank you all for participating. Such a beautiful day. I hope you get to enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
And thank you, Misty. Really enjoyed your presentation. And again, thank you everybody for joining us. Please consider joining us for future virtual Lunchbox talks as well. And if you're not currently a member of the Garden, please consider joining. And again, thank you all for attending, and we hope to see you soon at the Garden.